Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our first spring Positive Links session. Yay. I'm Jane Dutton, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Center for Positive Organization Scholarship, and I'm semi-retired, which is why I have this big smile, a lot of sunshine on my face. But I always come back for anything that the center does, especially for the Pos Links series, because I think it's always just a great learning environment. For how many of you is this your first Pos Links? Wow, look at that. Lindy, look at all these wonderful new people you brought in. That's fabulous. I want to tell you a little bit about the center. We are a center that tries to build a better world through the science and practice of thriving organizations. And we do this three ways. One is by developing students, their knowledge, their skills, and their practices to thrive in and lead thriving organizations. A second is to support the research on the development of thriving organizations. And finally, we aspire to develop tools, practices, and communities that advance thriving to make a positive difference in the world. So we have an ambitious mission and three sort of core pillars that we're trying to accomplish as part of the Ross School of Business. It's an exciting place to be. I also want to make sure that we acknowledge the different sponsors for this series, that we would not be able to have this kind of event without their support. So the University of Michigan's Organizational Learning Center, the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, the Samuel Zell and Robert H. Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, and finally two couples who are not institutes, Lisa and David Drews, and Diane and Paul Jones. So thank you again for your support. I mean, sometimes we choose to do this crazy little introductory thing where we invite you to do a 1-minute high-quality connection, but I'm not going to do that. So you just have to imagine that you're doing that, because I've had the opportunity to see what Lindy's going to offer to us, and I don't want to take up any of her time. But it is my just total pleasure to introduce Lindy Greer. And so I worked on the introduction, so I'm actually going to read it. Okay, there are some people, when they join an organization, drastically expand the capacity, the capability, and the potential for greatness in a system. Lindy Greer is one of those people. When she joined the Ross School of Business less than 1 year ago, the uplift in our Management and Organizations Department, in the Sanger Leadership Center, and the Ross School more generally was palpable. She brings deep expertise as a researcher into the design and structure of teams, managing conflicts, regulating emotions, and developing inclusive cultures for diverse teams. She has this wonderful knack for picking up critical topics like power and turning them on their head to reveal important new insights. As one of her former colleagues at Stanford told me, notice we stole her from Stanford, quote, "Lindy's work is theoretically rich and methodologically rigorous, but also useful from a practical standpoint. Her ideas really resonate with entrepreneurs and leaders who are living the challenges she studies. I know from talking to her former students that her teaching is truly transformative. Students leave her classroom as more efficacious team leaders. Her work is impactful in terms of both theory and practice. This colleague also said that these strengths make her very much a Michigander. Go Blue!" We sure are glad she joined us. Two other fun facts about Lindy besides her dog Creed, who has his own Instagram account, which I've now visited. Lindy's been identified both as a rock star in terms of the Poets and Quants list of the top 40 under 40 business school professors, and she was also just named as one of the 50 thinkers to watch in 2020. We're so fortunate to have her here with Pos Links, presenting her talk on how to create positive teams and organizational hierarchies. So please join me in welcoming the magnificent Lindy Greer.
Thank you, Jane, for such a warm and wonderful and very Michigan introduction. I am so thrilled to be part of this family and this community, and I'm so happy to see so many members of my family here today. So thank you for being here. The work today spans over 15 years and is kind of a life story and research. So I'm going to walk you through where I started in my 20s as a very naive youngster and wanting to overthrow the hierarchies of the world, to where I am today saying, actually, we should teach leadership. Those hierarchies work. So let me tell you how I went from there to there. So hierarchy is everywhere. Whether you're looking in the animal kingdom, you're looking at organizations, you're looking in social media. We're constantly ranking things. What's better or worse, who's number one, who's number two. It's an automatic process. It has a lot of functionality. It allows us to make sense of the world, simplify information, and make decisions. However, as you can see from this picture of hierarchy, it doesn't always look pleasant. And at least to me when I was younger, and you would see leadership being badly done, I would think hierarchy was the issue, that hierarchy forces us into this dominance and this aggression and this conflict. Yet it remains. And for some reasons, it came from evolution. It allowed us to coordinate. Back in cave people days, if someone said, throw the spear now to take down the mammoth, it was essential to have that leader, right? To coordinate action, to make sure you're actually able to work together in groups. So it sticks around. It has some functions, yet it seems unpleasant. So what do we do with it? So 15 years of research, many members of my family that I owe a huge thank you to for inspiring me and helping me on this journey to understand hierarchy, colleagues that span the entire world and who make my daily life wonderful. I'm not going to name all of them, but they all are up there. I will point out a few, including grad student Carl Larson in the audience, as well as Christina Bradley, as well as Elizabeth Trin, who we just recruited to join our PhD program in the fall, and we're super excited for her to join. She might be watching, hence the plug, to make sure she really does come. Okay. So thank you to all of you. Talk overview today. So what is hierarchy? How do you design it to be effective? And then once you have it there, how do you lead when you're at the top of it? So to give you a little bit of the world that I live in, basically every social situation I look at, I'm putting into boxes like this. Over who's in the room, what are the personalities, the diversity, the things they bring to the table, what's the social structure of the situation, what is the hierarchy? There's work in sociology saying that we can assess the hierarchy across a group of people automatically, across hundreds of different traits. We basically have a calculator on our forehead that says our status score in any given situation. A little bit terrifying, but it is this automatically derived process that we all are constantly status sorting. So in any given situation, there is some sort of hierarchical structure that has likely emerged. This in turn changes the way we talk to people, of whether you speak up, whether you don't speak up, whether you're willing to engage in conflict or not. And ultimately, every business outcome that we care about in a business school in terms of doing good in the world, creating change, working for the triple bottom line, it all comes back to how we work together. And that comes back from how we structured our interactions, and ideally then also who's managing that structure. So most of my research studies, you're going to be seeing in this lens of, what is the input, the design of the team, what is the performance, and how do we treat each other in the middle. So basic definition, again, on the same page for hierarchy, vertical differences, broadly stated. There's someone above, there's someone below. You can imagine, as we're going to do in a second, there's a lot of different ways you can draw this or conceptualize it, but across all the very many different forms it could take, that is the most simple distinction of a vertical rank order or a vertical difference. So examples of hierarchy. So interesting fact for you, the way that we draw a hierarchy like this actually came from railroad maps in the 1800s that got put on the wall. And somehow that way of doing these nodes and these connections came from that. But yet our visual metaphor of hierarchy looks like this, which isn't always necessarily pleasant if you're at the bottom of that graph. So to get you to live the experience of hierarchy with me, I want you to go ahead and grab the worksheet that you were given when you came in, and then map out your current team. And maybe it's a student project group you're in, maybe it's your research collaboration. I'd be curious to see what the hierarchies look like. It could also be your company at work. But think of it within the team level. So like 3 to 10 people within a team. Is it one person at the top? Are there 2 people at the top or 3? How many prongs are there? Is it how many layers are built in? Is it just a leader and followers, or are there 5 different layers? So go through your current team and draw it out. I'm seeing some interesting pictures being drawn. So if you look at the picture you have and take a glance at the pictures next to you, there's a lot of things you could think about of what can matter about hierarchy and the different ways we structure hierarchy. How many people are at the top? I heard a rumor from the trenches that our department chair, our boss, is actually at the top up here. Glad to hear. Sue, you're our official leader. It could be, though, that you have co-leadership. You could even have 3 leaders. And then how many layers are there could matter, and also the distance between the layers. If sometimes in the lab, when people draw the hierarchy, they have the boss and then a long line down to the rest of the team, which says something. I think our department, we respect Sue that high, but we are fairly flat in how we operate. Also, it matters, too, how many direct reports there are to a leader. You can imagine a leader's job and how a hierarchy works is very different if there's 12 people flowing into one leader versus a leader has like 2 second-in-commands that each have 3 people of their own, which looks a little bit more like our Saner Center, which I think can be effective. So think about your picture. Also, sometimes people say we don't have a hierarchy, and they draw a circle. Do we have any circles today? Academics, of course. So you also could have circles. So talk a little bit about that. So in my quest to understand hierarchy, I realized there's not really alternatives to hierarchy. We can try to do teams that work in circles, but it's kind of hard. And in real organizations, the only thing that's really arisen is something like holacracy, which I'll get into in a minute, and that doesn't really work. Most of us live within some level of hierarchy. So as I go through the data on this now, I'm going to give you some dimensions of hierarchy that are effective versus not effective. Go back to your drawing and be thinking about, okay, at the end of the next 15 minutes, how, if I got the chance to redo this hierarchy, would I redraw it differently? Deal? Then afterwards, I'm going to get into behaviors and how we can all lead differently. Okay. So again, why we need it. As you saw with the cave people throwing spears, hierarchy is an evolutionary derived mechanism, one of the simplest heuristics that we have to know how to work together. There's a lot of studies in economics showing, for example, that if you have 2 people that are lost in New York City and have to figure out how to find one another again, having one person have more status is a great cue to say, okay, we don't have to figure out between the 2 of us where to meet. I'm just going to go where that person that has status goes, which is likely, Central Station or whatever. But it allows you a way to simplify information, to make decisions, to coordinate. There's studies in basketball teams that having a clear leader on a basketball team allows people to call shots better on the floor of the basketball team. So we do need it, and there's a lot of data supporting this. I reviewed papers from Cameron Anderson at Berkeley is one of the big figures in this area, Adam Galinsky at Columbia, and Joe McGee at NYU. So if you want more depth in this area, those are some great reviews of just hierarchy broadly stated and the coordination mechanism. Again, though, the point that I entered this literature was rebellious 20-something, who said, by gosh, hierarchy is awful. There's problems. Game of Thrones, for goodness sake. It goes badly wrong. So I've done a whole lot of research with my collaborators documenting the many nefarious ways in which hierarchy also can cause conflict. That just as well as it can cause coordination or the ability to work together, it also can cause tensions and inequities. If you think about the picture that you drew, and you just look at that top-down hierarchy, and if you're at the bottom of that hierarchy, it doesn't always feel good just looking at that visual. And day to day, having someone to tell you what to do, it can cause resentment, inequity, jealousy, rivalry, competition, and conflict. So how is it then that we're able to have these benefits of coordination is if this Game of Thrones to the death is what hierarchy can also incite? The other big challenge that you've seen on hierarchy going wrong comes out of some work done by Michigan by Lee Tost, who unfortunately now is in California, but we still love her anyways. And she had research showing that when power distance increases, so that line of the boss is up here and the team that's way down there, and those types of teams, people don't speak up. They don't voice things. They're not creative. And so in hierarchy, it can have 2 very nefarious reactions, one of which we really dislike one another and we blatantly engage in conflict, or it could just make us shut down and get very quiet, and maybe we engage a subterfuge behind the scenes to overthrow the hierarchy. So there's a lot of work saying that it's good, a lot of work now saying that it's bad. So I was left with this question that a few years ago, I was at a conference then where there are all these different research groups that were looking at hierarchy were presenting. They had different names for it. So you had some people that were looking at shared leadership. And so they would do a lab study where they manipulated whether or not you had 3 leaders that were equal or a leader and 2 followers. Went to the next session. They were actually calling it hierarchy. You had a leader, 2 followers, 3 people that were equal, same manipulation. And then you went to another one. It was like empowering leadership versus not, or self-managing teams. Forget even the term. Exact same manipulation. They weren't talking to one another. And so it's like all of us are spinning our wheels. So some of us are saying hierarchy is great. I'm in my own little silo saying hierarchy is horrible. And there's 5 other literatures that are also having the same discussion. How can we get everybody on the same page and actually have strong theory and strong paradigm development about the good and the bad of hierarchy? So I embarked on a project that was probably 8 years of love and tension within my team to get this paper published. But looking at a meta-analysis that would come back to the conclusive question then of is it good or bad? So for a meta-analysis, you go and you gather every data set ever collected on a topic. So within this project, we got data sets, the results of data from baseball teams and salary dispersions and how many games they won. We looked at management teams and how much money they made based on how big their hierarchy was or not. We looked at laboratory studies. We looked at surveys of whether it was a self-managed team or not, all within one bucket across sociology, psychology, economics, and management. But I really wanted to know the answer to this question. You know, aside from disciplinary views, like, is hierarchy good or bad? And so as we went through the literature, again, we documented these same, downsides and upsides. There is a lot of consensus of whether you're looking at evolutionary psychology or in management, that hierarchy is a very useful coordination heuristic that simplifies information. At the same time, across disciplines, hierarchy also can lead to fights over the pecking order in animals or humans, especially in the boardroom. So it has good and downsides. So as I said, it foreshadowed, you can see where we ended up, which is hierarchy is slightly negative. And so me at 29 was like, yes, I figured it out. I was right all along. Hierarchy is slightly negative. As reviewers rightly pointed out, very small effect size, which means there is a lot of room for variability and a lot of different shapes and forms of hierarchy and ways in which hierarchy is actually utilized in practice. So after I found this effect and we got this paper published, it was like, okay, well, if hierarchy is bad, what do I tell my students then? What's next? Do away with the hierarchy, what are you left with? Well, there's a lot in the media right now about holacracy, which is probably the most visible alternative to hierarchy that's existed in companies. So if hierarchy is bad, and why didn't you go do this? Well, the trouble is to do holacracy, people often have to have like a 100-page manual of processes to understand how it works. And if you don't know holacracy, it's cross-functional reporting circles that interlock across a company. And just by my description of this, you can understand how complicated that might be to scale an organization when you have to have a 100-page user manual to do it. And so it was in the news even a few weeks ago that Zappos, which is probably the most famous company to roll this out, is starting to scale back on holacracy and trying not to let the world know they're doing this. Which is because they really went out on a limb for this. And so both Zappos and I think both quietly agree now of, okay, as much as I don't like the idea of people having to be less than someone else, it actually is a functional mechanism. Which led me into this next line of work then of, okay, well, maybe it's not necessarily so much the hierarchy itself, but how it makes people feel. Like, what is the lived experience when you're within the hierarchy? So how can we design reporting structures in ways that are more humane, as well as learn to lead from the top of those structures in ways where you don't feel less than, and you actually have a useful mechanism to figure out how to coordinate social interaction. So I'm going to move now to the structure of hierarchy and a whole lot of data and empirical work we've been doing about how do you actually draw out this reporting structure. I'm going to give you 4 takeaways and foreshadowing it now. So the 4 main data sets that we have, or papers or projects on this, is who you put into those buckets in your graph matters a whole lot. So the person at the top of the hierarchy should have the most general information and overview and expertise. They should know more overall about the thing they're doing than anybody else on the team. If they don't, and this is a project with Elizabeth who's coming here soon, you get shadow hierarchies that emerge and start to overthrow the main hierarchy. And also, if the person who's leading the charge doesn't actually know what they're doing, you're going to fall off a cliff. So number 1, your hierarchies need to be expertise-based, and I'll show you the data for this in a second. Number 2, that whenever you start to get hierarchies that go up, and you go back to that feeling of resentment and smallness, one of the best ways to balance that out is whenever you build a layer up, to build horizontal differentiation to the sides. So maybe Sue's department chair, but I probably know a little bit more about startup teams than Sue. So I report to her, she's formally my boss and I look up to her, but I have this little domain of turf of mine of startup teams where it's mine. And like if you ask me how to make decisions in my startup class, I can make decisions in there because that's my area of ownership where I know the most. Then anything that impacts the whole department, that's Sue's area. So whenever you start to go up, the more that you can have those horizontal differences, it does a whole lot of good in terms of organizing things as well as managing some of the negative psychology that can arise when you have hierarchy. The other one is a fun line of work I have with CUU, who just got her first academic job at Rice, we also have other Michigan grads, is looking at how many ranks a hierarchy has. And so if it's a ladder versus if it's a triangle or pyramid. And showing that sense of inequity and competition is much worse when you have that full-on rank order. And it's a lot easier if you have the pyramid or the triangle, one person at top and then more people at the same rank at the bottom to offer each other social support. Final one I'll get into is that distance between top and bottom. And so having a clear leader where we all can point to the person and be like, yes, Sue is our leader, but that distance from top to bottom, having that smaller can be helpful. And I'll show some of the different ways you can do that. Okay, so first one. This was a study I did at Stanford a few years ago with a former student from the Netherlands. He initially had a really cool computer simulation, which is the first time I had experience with that type of method of actually doing research. And he was able to do a computer agent-based model where he showed that if the leader was not the person with the most expertise, the players in the game gravitated towards a bad solution. So he came to me, he's like, okay, you do groups experiments and groups research. How do we test this in the wild? So we did a field study of Dutch tax collectors where we looked at a couple hundred Dutch tax collecting teams, measured the expertise of their leader, and looked at the client satisfaction with how they worked with the client. And showed in that study then that when the leaders had the most expertise of anybody in the team, they had better outcomes within the tax auditing teams. Then the big study that I want to show you then is we looked at, okay, well, how often do you actually choose leaders that have the most expertise? And in an experimental setting where you can control for all these other factors, can we show experimentally then that leaders that have more expertise lead teams that perform better or worse? In short, with Stanford undergrads, very smart kids, obviously not Michigan, what we found is this is what they chose for leadership more often than not. So we had them do a game where they had to survive in the desert, and they had to rank order items in their utility. Each of them did it on their own, and then we told them their score. And we told, Charlie and Dave and Sue how many points they had. And they said, okay, you now know how well each of you did. You're now going to do the same task together. Choose your leader. And so rather than choosing the person that actually had the best score, a good proportion chose their leaders based on things that look like this, going back to our cave people metaphor that we have for leadership in our head. So 55% chose expertise, 45%, which is nearly half of the groups, chose their leader based on things like dominance, attractiveness, speaking time, if you knew them before, the width of their cheeks. Terrifying, because again, I think they're just supposed to be smart kids, and you literally tell them who is the smartest person to make a decision with them to lead this discussion, and they chose leaders for these other situations. You can imagine then what happened for the teams that chose those leaders based on expertise versus not. That, of course, those who chose the leader that looked like, scary person on the horse didn't do very well in this intellectual decision-making task. They actually died in the desert in the task. The teams that chose the person that had the most points, that knew the most, performed much better in this situation. So this starts to lead into the idea then that maybe it isn't always hierarchy that's the problem, but how we, for example, promote people within organizations, and how can we have more objective criteria that's more inclusive, and action-based for specific indicators, or the people that are making it to the top actually have the competence to be there, and that's the heuristic that we're using. One of my other buckets of research for those that is also diversity and inclusion. And this paper I love because it intersects a lot of my different research lives. Okay. Number 2 then, this is what I was mentioning then of, okay, make sure your leader actually has the most expertise. And then as you're crafting out the runs below the leader, make sure that each person has their own sandbox to play in. So in this one, we did a study of startup teams. We did a field experiment at incubators around the country. So we visited Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach, which is LA, Silicon Peach, which is Atlanta, a couple of other silicons. I'm very grateful we do not have a silicon in Michigan. At least we try to be ourselves. So we did a field experiment where we had them I gave an hour-long training on the psychology of startup teams, and while they were there, I had them do the marshmallow challenge, where you had to build a tower with a marshmallow at the top, and so you could build the tallest one. We measured before they came in whether they had a hierarchy or not, and how hierarchically differentiated they were, because I didn't want to manipulate that in a real startup. But what we did manipulate was the horizontal differentiation via a job crafting exercise, which actually comes out of Michigan. And so we had them say, okay, thinking about what you're doing in your startup, each person please write a role description specific to what you do and have a job title that goes with it. And then the other ones, we had a control condition. So some teams had a hierarchy or not, and then some teams had horizontal differentiation or not. The job titles they came up with are amazing. We had the Taylor Swift of sales, the always peppy Khaleesi of HR for Game of Thrones fans. So they really got into it and really crafted out their unique identities within the team. So what was very interesting then is in the teams that had no hierarchy and they did the control condition, so they didn't try to differentiate themselves horizontally, It's kind of chaotic. They had a hard time coming to consensus of how to build their tower. They didn't have a clear structure. And the teams that had a hierarchy, but they didn't go through this role differentiation exercise, it was much more competitive and cutthroat. There's more arguing, there's more competition, and they had less tall towers within the task. And by the way, these towers correlated with funding 6 months down the road with a small sample size, but marginal correlation. For the teams that did the silos, so they actually did the job crafting, but there was no hierarchy, they had silos and they didn't coordinate together. And so they weren't able to put the pieces back together again. The optimal sweet spot, and I'll get into this in a little bit because this is, if I ever do a book in this area, many of you have seen me talk on this, the thesis of the hippo pond. I'll show you the picture for this to make sense in a second. But in the hippo pond, you have a clear leader, a clear hippo, and you have different areas. And that was a sweet spot then, that if the teams had clear vertical differentiation to coordinate and clear horizontal differentiation to give that people that piece of ownership, that piece of feeling good, that area to make your own decisions to where the leader actually could truly capitalize on having other people on the team, those startup teams had the tallest marshmallow towers, which then went back to startup funding. Paper number 3 here with CU. This was a whole host of studies in a psychology journal, primarily experimental, where we put teams into different hierarchies that were ladder-shaped versus triangular-shaped. And we found that in teams where they had to work together and there was a clear rank order of 5 people, of you're the boss, and so-and-so and so-and-so, those teams had lower quality relationships than teams that had a triangular hierarchy. That there was this level of social relationship quality, social support that was derived from having the bottom of the pyramid. And the mechanism within this then is the rank differentiation that focused on who's who vertically was reduced the minute you had other people at the same layer with you. Final bit of data I'll give you on this one is this is new work I'm doing with Elizabeth Tren. And the idea then of what are the different ways that you can keep the distance short. And so one of the really counterintuitive, going back to liking to throw things on their head and provocative findings that Elizabeth and I are finding, if you have that hierarchy, clear leader, 4 people at the bottom that are horizontally differentiated, if you have a second in command to informally links the leader to the rest of the team, those teams for people within the team feel the team's actually flatter. That it makes the leader more accessible, translate what the leader is saying, because often leaders are more externally facing. And so having someone who's a clear linchpin between the leader and the rest of the team, by actually adding in, paradoxically, another layer of hierarchy, actually can make the team feel less hierarchical. So this is really new stuff, or just a very simple MTurk studies at this point, and working on doing a group level lab study in the fall once Elizabeth is here. There's some other research I've done that touches on this, that the more that there is extremities and how power is manifested in organizations, you can think about bonuses, corner offices, etc., it exacerbates those feelings of inequity that come with the hierarchy. So the more that you have a clear formal leader, but the way in which that's propped up is kept smaller, the easier it is to accept hierarchy and not have some of those psychological consequences in terms of conflict, competition, and losing voice. Okay, so I just threw a lot of data at you in a nutshell, and my MBA students know I have a bad tendency for doing that. So I'm going to take a moment to breathe and to think. Let's go back to the picture that you drew. Knowing what you now know about the virtues of keeping the power distance flat, having horizontal differentiation, the virtues of second in command, if you had the luxury to redraw your team's structure, what would it look like? Okay, so 4 big takeaways in this one. Make sure your hierarchies are based on expertise, which also does a lot of good for things like diversity and inclusion. Make sure that you actually have the objective criteria for what you need to get to the top. Make sure that as you start to add layers, for example, in a scaling startup, that as layers go up, layers also need to go to the side too. They start to horizontally differentiate as well. Triangle beats ladder. That being said, having a little half step of a second in command could be a good thing. And keep the power distance small. So what does this look like if you had to draw it? If I had to draw how to do one of the charts that you just did. So this is how it's often done, right? And again, if you're coder number one in this hierarchy, like I would feel pretty crappy, honestly. I'm a minion, I report up, I don't even get to talk to the CEO directly, I don't know who I am, I have nothing I own. Another way you can think of drawing this and getting away from like the railroad charts and actually being a little bit more creative is having a circle where everybody has areas of ownership. So now coder one, rather than being a minion, owns an entire bit of area of the pie, if you will. So does coder two, and it also makes clear then to like the CTO who manages the coders that in areas where that coder one has more expertise on a certain topic than the CTO, coder one gets to make those decisions. That's not the CTO's job. Start to move you over to my hippopond story. Imagine now this circle is your pond. And the hippopotamus, very large, scary creature, owns the pond, swims around in the pond. He hires his first two team members, including the sales, VP of sales, builds an island for VP of sales to live on, as well as for the chief technology officer. CTO then hires a few coders to work for her too. Job within this hierarchy then of a leader is to make sure that people have the resources they need to do well, to monitor the perimeter of the pond against intruders, to go get food from the outside if needed. And if there's an issue, if the two islands go to war, like you better intervene and fix the story. So one of the things that's important about this hippopond idea then, and I got this from a CEO of the Netherlands who was this very large, big personality, been brought in new to an organization, and people were terrified. And so he used the hippo story to refer to himself then as, okay, I had to learn how not to be the hippo. And the way that he was talking about it then was how to make himself smaller in meetings. Even though you are always a hippo, as in also the animal. You are always a CEO, you're always a leader. But the more that you learn to go above water where you need to chase off the lions on the perimeter, or to go on the island if there's a problem in technology where they're having trouble hiring, but then go underwater and listen and empower and monitor the situation and get out of the way of your employees, it starts to understand then about how this type of visual metaphor can not only help you better structure your team, but think about how can you better lead your team. How can you have teams that have hierarchy, but also at the same time, and paradoxically, have areas of flatness, have moments of equality, and areas of ownership where people actually within that area, they have their own hierarchy. And one iteration of this line of work, we talked about multiple hierarchical bases, which I can't even say when I present, so that title died, and we're still figuring out an academic way to call the hippopond, but I'm open for ideas. But the idea being then within this picture, coder 2 here has no hierarchy of their own. In that picture now, within coder 2, so maybe the front end of their website, they're the best. They know more about how to do the front end of a website than anybody. There is a hierarchy at which they're at the top. And so rather than having this fixed sum idea of hierarchy where there's the CEO and the leader and everybody else, you now have a more multifaceted understanding then of, okay, there is a CEO, there is that hierarchy, but there's also a sales hierarchy where the VP of sales is on the top. There's a technology hierarchy where the CTO is on top. But there's also a specialized domain of, say, the user interface where they are on top. And so now if you're thinking back to that social psychology over how do I fill in a hierarchy, you have choice then about how to socially construe the situation. It's no longer a leader and everybody else, but okay, we have the leader, but at the same time, I also have my own position, my areas of ownership where I get to lead. And so this really, in my mind, helped me think about what does a good hierarchy look like? So let me transition you now into my quest I've had the last 5 years or so for, okay, coming to accept we need hierarchy. There's ways in which you can design it better than others. How then do you manage it day to day? Like once you have that role structure down, what does it mean to lead a hierarchy effectively? So as I started on this question, I tend to talk to people a whole lot when I'm stewing on a new research idea. I talk to my students, I talk to my friends, talk to random people walking their dogs, which is how I got a lot of speakers for my startup class. Just tell me about how your team works. Tell me about the way your organization works. And so when I was asking people about this question, I'm like, is your team more hierarchical? Is it more flat? And my question is like, is there a flat team that actually works? I got back this type of answer often of like, there actually is a formal hierarchy. We all know who the boss is, but that's not how we interact. Like we know who's there, and if something happens, like we know they're going to be there. But day to day, it feels flatter. And so this set me on the quest, as many research quests have been on, for what I was calling the myth of equality. That within hierarchical teams, it can still feel equal. And what does that look like and how does it work? So I did a set of lab studies for a year or two that failed over and over and over again. and research learning, where I try to say, okay, if you manipulate hierarchy and equality at exactly the same time, that should be the best team. Doesn't work. I tried power hierarchy, status equality, all the different ways you could try to have these two things coexist. I could not stuff it into a 2x2 like a good social psychologist. So I talked to more MBA students and came up with some ideas. Okay, well, maybe it's not able to be stuffed into 2x2 because maybe there's a temporal sequencing. That maybe there's moments of hierarchy, and in the same team, there's also moments of equality. And let me give you some ideas about how I got there. So the idea that I'm going to be moving into now is the idea that you can have hierarchy and equality, but good leaders can shift or flex between one or the other, that they're able to enact the hierarchy to be ferocious and chase off the lions from the pond if you need to, then go back underwater and just monitor the situation and empower people on those islands, have that moment of flatness and other moments. So the story I had from one of my MBA students a few years ago is I was also, as always in class, like, please help me. So I think my students give you better ideas than I give them half the time. It's like, please help me. I cannot make my lab experiments work. How do you do hierarchy in the SEALs? Like, that's a really good organization. How do you do hierarchy there? And so he had this just really inspiring story that changed the shape of my research now for a few years, where he's like, okay, well, if we're on a mission, there's a very clear hierarchy, a clear chain of command. You know, if someone says, get out now, there's no devil's advocacy, there's no voice, like you listen, you move, there's a hierarchy. But then when they go back to base to debrief and make sure that they understood what happened, they make a plan to do it better next time, they literally take their stripes off at the door, leave them outside the room, go in, round table, everybody knows it's a ritual for them in their culture, everybody should speak up, because it could be the most junior person in that team, in that hierarchy, has seen a sniper in that mission that no one else saw. And so that's critical information. You need to get up to the top of the hierarchy. So they've ritualized this moment of flatness where they go in, they debrief, and talk about, okay, how can we do this better next time? Make a plan, go out the door, put on the stripes, and then literally fall into rank again. And so they're able to do this flex. So this has been like one of the things that's fascinated me more than almost anything else for the last few years. You can't put a flex easily into a 2x2 in the lab. I've been trying. Better way to study it is to do what Jane Dutton is very well known for, which is qualitative research. So I went out into the wild to see, okay, the Navy SEALs can do this, but can anybody else? Does this actually exist in the real world? And so together with two of my favorite grad students, Charles Chu, who's now a third year at Stanford, and Nicole Abiesber, who's a second year at HBS and was my research assistant for many years, we went out and we lived in startups. So we lived in 8 startups, about 6 months in total. Lots of observations, lots of interviews, a lot of amazing and terrifying people stories. The worst one was where there was a teddy bear on a stick in a very hierarchical company, and whenever the boss got angry, the poor kid would pat himself with the teddy bear. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly in startups, like the whole spectrum was there. And I really felt like many of the startups was watching Silicon Valley. But that being said, there were a few exemplary leaders. So of the 8 teams we looked at, we had 2 that were clearly flexing. They clearly were able to navigate this tension between, at times, pulling in the reins, calling the shots, driving action, versus at other times, letting people have power, bringing people to speak up. I also have had a few that were stuck in hierarchy. They were just like super hierarchical. There is a big hotshot CEO. No one would speak up. One of the meetings we were in, the CEO was trying to show, because you try not to be noticed when you're observing, but even then. So he was trying to show what a good leader he was. So he made them read an article of mine while I was observing. And then asked them, it's like, okay, what do you think about this article? And they all just stared at him. Literally 5 minutes of silence. Incredibly painful, especially for me in that moment. Super awkward. He was like, well, we talked about that. And just moved on as if nothing had happened. So that was a team that was just very stuck in hierarchy. There was no flexing. What was even more interesting, though, was in the teams that were stuck in equality, they actually were secretly even more hierarchical. So in these teams, they sometimes didn't even have a formal leader. Instead, they're like, we're a startup. We don't want to be like one of those big bureaucratic tech companies. We're not going to do hierarchy. But then in order to get stuff done, it meant that they were constantly having to micromanage one another, and the leader especially. And so the lived experience, the felt experience in that team that didn't have a leader actually felt even more hierarchical than some of the hierarchical teams because of the degree of micromanaging to glue things together. Because you didn't have the organizational structure to empower people to have a clear pecking order for decisions. It meant that literally, like I was in one startup then where they said they didn't do meetings. Obviously a startup that didn't do hierarchy or meetings. But they sat talking to another the whole day. And so like every time one of those coders typed a line of code, he would look at the other one and like, what would Jared do? And Jared, of course, would be looped in. It's like the whole day, there's like this level of dependency and micromanaging because they didn't actually have the clarity of structure. So what was fascinating to me then was you had flexing, you had hierarchy, and you had equality that was fake equality. So a few details on this. So summarizing the study as we're writing it up. So in the interviews, would you say your team is more flat or more hierarchical? And for some people, you say, do I have to give a bipolar definition? And others would say, actually, you need both, that you need a hierarchy and you need equality in order to do well in a company. So the conclusions, as we're puzzling together this paper to get out to submission, and hopefully in the spring, is some teams flex, other teams are stuck. Either they're stuck in a hierarchy or they're stuck in this micromanaged form of equality where it's very hard to scale or be efficient and they don't make decisions. Hierarchical flexing we're defining as the degree to which teams can accentuate or flatten the hierarchy to match the task. And the thing that's important in this, it wasn't just like the leader arbitrarily said, okay, you're empowered, go do it. And now I'm leader again. There was a clear match to what was happening. So when they needed to brainstorm, there was empowerment. When they needed to take action, the hierarchy kicked in again. And so leaders had this really good situational awareness, going back to old school Michigan research from the 1960s, over what the team needed when, and they could activate the right social structure to match that situation. Teams that flexed, and this is where a lot of our work in this paper is what does this look like? How do you flex? And that's also driving my research probably for the next 5 to 10 years now, then is how do you do this, actually? So teams that flex, they had leaders who had this interesting balance of confidence and humility. And they're very much the conductor. These flexes are driven by the leader. So going back to the idea that you are the hippo, you're consciously choosing to be above the water or below the water. As you're listening to this talk, one of the things I would encourage you to reflect on as you think of the last time that you led, what was easier for you? Confidence, being the hippo above water, chasing off the lions? Or humility and going underwater, letting other people speak? For everybody, it tends to be easier one side or the other. I know for myself, I have been more on the humble side, and it can be scary to give a talk like this or stand up and to lead. And the first 2 times that I tried to come out of my comfort zone of empowering others and to lead, I was really heavy-handed. I was way too aggressive, way too assertive. I terrified people. We'd go back to my safe spot. But eventually, it started to swing around in the pendulum enough. I started to acquire the tools to where it gets easier, and I'm still a long way from being there, obviously, but it gets easier to swing a little bit more to hierarchy when I need to, and then to swing back to my comfort zone where I have a lot of nuance in terms of how to empower others. And as you're thinking about takeaways from this talk, I would encourage you to think, okay, where am I in this journey? What swing is easier or harder for me to do? And what's an experiment? Because this is one of my big theses in leadership development, as the Sainer team knows. How do I change my behavior? What is an experiment or hypothesis I could have to try in my next meeting with my team to try a behavior that I'm not typically comfortable with? So if you think about like the optimally flexed team meeting, you have a leader who comes in who is the hippo above water, has a clear vision, has a clear goal, this is where we're going, this is a North Star. Very much leader behavior to the front. And then says, okay, I hired all of you because you're smarter than me. I'm going to get out of the way. And so some of the companies you saw, the leaders literally even physically go to the back of the room and sit down and make themselves small and just listen. And then someone would say, hey, like, I don't know what to do with this decision. And they would make themselves big again and speak up and then get out of the way. And then at the end of the meeting, come back out of the water again because, okay, I heard this is where we're going. So if you think back to the last time that you ran a meeting as a leader, which part of this was easier or harder? And what could you work on? Maybe it's giving a better North Star, an action plan at the start of the meeting. Or maybe it's making the decision of calling the shot at the end of the day, because if you look at the literature on decision making, the leader decides is usually the best decision rule, presuming that the leader actually is the one that has the most expertise. But sometimes it's hard for leaders to be able to say, I'm going to take the decision now. So, or maybe it's the empowering part. You know, there's a lot of data showing that in the average team meeting, 80% of the speaking time is done by 20% of the people, which means in your average 5-person meeting, one person talks 80% of the time, and guess who that is? Looking at you, hippo. So how do you turn that off and empower others? So things to think about from this study in terms of the leadership component. In terms of flexing, the other thing that was interesting too is that teams that were able to do this well, in addition to the leader calling the shots either way, teams that were able to be flexed, that were willing to be flexed, had a very strong mission. So if you think back to where I got this example, it came from the SEALs. Like, that's a very strong purpose, a very strong mission. You can imagine then if you don't have a strong purpose or mission, you don't really know why you're doing what you're doing, and someone says, hey, fall into rank, go be coder number 2 at the bottom of the hierarchy, that's pretty unpleasant. You'll do it if you know that it has meaning. But if you don't believe in the bigger picture, it's not really going to be worthwhile for you to fall into rank when the leader says, hey, we're moving now, get into order. So the teams that did this well had strong missions, and they also had ritualized sufflexes. Like in the Navy SEALs example, they had the stripes. On some of the startups that we saw, there was a basketball that got passed around when it was brainstorm time, when everybody should speak up. There's also Post-it startups that whenever they wanted to equalize voice, the Post-its came out. Also sometimes rooms, traditions, and whenever we go on an offsite, for example, is when everybody has a chance to speak up. But it's become baked into the culture that people knew and they expected when they were going to be in hierarchy versus when they're going to be in equality. One of the things that was interesting to me, especially where I was coming from of hating hierarchy coming into this, was what percentage of the time teams spent in hierarchy versus equality. And at least based on the observational data that we have, it skews a lot more towards hierarchy. Like 75-80% of the time is in hierarchy, actually. And a smaller percentage of that is in equality. And we still need better data to test this, but I was surprised by that. That most of the time is people doing their jobs, heads down, doing their work. And then in the team meeting then, you have the leader giving the vision and making the decision, and then that bit in the middle of sharing. But like that type of decision-making meeting is only one of the many things you do in a team. A lot of the work in a team is just doing your job, in which case the hierarchy is always there. So a lot of the work now that I'm getting into is, okay, like this is all well and good, but those exact signals, if I'm a leader, I'm trying to learn how to flex, how do I make a team feel flat? How do I make them feel safe to speak up? How in those moments can I actually create the semblance of equality? So one starting point was like, okay, we know a lot about how not to create equality and how to enact hierarchy. And so there's a lot of work that I fell into on leader emotional unpredictability. That if people don't know what to expect from you, if those fluxes are very random, if they don't know if you're going to get good or bad feedback from the boss depending on the day, that distance perceptually feels really big because the leader has all the power. They're calling the shots. You have no idea what's going to happen when. You're entirely dependent on them. In contrast, the more that you're predictable and talking about emotions, giving that type of feedback, the more people know what's going to happen and they feel safe. It's easier for them to speak up. It's easier for them to accept the fluxes because it's become ritualized. So in this study, a couple of studies here. So one is with a group of colleagues in the Netherlands. We show the more that the leaders are emotionally predictable, it makes groups more cooperative. It allows more of that information sharing and getting along. I also have worked with Alyssa Yu at Stanford, one of the PhD students there who's amazing, where we did a couple of lab experiments and we showed that if we mutually acknowledge each other's emotions, so if I'm a leader and I'm working with Dave, and I come in and say, hey, Dave, I'm a little stressed about this talk I'm giving. How are you feeling today? And Dave shared how he was feeling. That decreases the power distance that's perceived between Dave and I. And it's funny because I started off in this line of emotions trying to think of it as a palate cleanser and not thinking it was going to go back to flexing and power and hierarchy. But guess what? The most important thing we found happened when we both shared our emotions with one another is it made the feeling of hierarchy go away. So as I'm trying to put together all this work, it does suggest then that one of the levers by which you can flex power in teams is the degree to which you create vulnerability. Thinking about Brene Brown and others, that type of human connection is what allows for those bursts, those moments of flatness when you need it in a team. And this relates to the hippopond. So the other line of work I've been working on too is showing that when you're in social situations and there's a hierarchy and we really want to get along, I used to see this at horse shows. I used to compete fanatically at dressage. And someone would win and your friend didn't. And so you immediately try to highlight something good that they did. Like, your horse looked beautiful. Your grooming was so much better than mine. And you would flip it to a different dimension of the hierarchy. We call this hierarchy flipping. And so you can imagine that the more you live in that hippopond where each person has an area of ownership, it's easier for teams than to say, hey, maybe I may be the formal leader, but that thing you do, I can't do. That's much better than what I do. And so we have a couple of lab experiments in this realm now, as well as a field experiment showing that if you are able to trade hierarchy, flip hierarchy to allow each person to have that little area of turf, the hierarchy actually is more effective because it's experienced as less steep. Okay, that was a lot of data. I got through all my data though. So moving over to where we stand at this point about at least leadership and hierarchy at the intersection. So to lead well from the top of a hierarchy, you need the confidence to actually use the hierarchy, to enact the hierarchy, to channel action. At the same time, you also need the humility to have those moments of flatness built into your team, of where you're able to say, yes, hippo, but going underwater for right now. Let's talk about emotions. Let's get touchy-feely. Let's share information, make a good decision. And then we could go back to doing our work and falling into hierarchy. So leaders need both confidence and humility and the tools to enact each of these to lead well. Activating the hierarchy requires the team to have all the good things we talked about earlier in terms of the structure. So all those things come into play here. Then it's much easier to flex a hierarchy that is a good hierarchy, where there's expertise in the top, triangular shaped, maybe a second in command, etc. Plus, what we find too that you're seeing is that if teams know they're going to have that moment of flatness, they accept the flex back to hierarchy more easily because they know it's not permanent. They know that the next time you're going to brainstorm, that moment of flatness is coming. On the leader side, flexing the hierarchy, this is really tiny, requires the cues, the rituals, and in addition to the leadership skills in terms of flattening it out, in terms of how you share emotions, as well as calling out these different hierarchies. There's a lot of levers you can imagine beyond just sharing emotion, finding these different hierarchy bases that you could be using to flatten the team, which is why I need to talk to experts like Gretchen on empowerment. And Carl and I are doing a review of every literature known to humankind right now on this topic to understand like, what are the other levers that exist in different literatures that we can bring into this hierarchy story of what are the ways you can flexibly manage hierarchy to get the best of both worlds. So I would argue it's time to consider modern organizational design, not railroad charts from 1800s. Give people areas of ownership, create different hierarchies in the team, and learn to go above water and below water. Be a good hippo. On that note, take a few moments for takeaways on the leadership side. So we talked about how you'd redo your hierarchy in your team. So whether you're the leader or someone else is the leader, what recommendations would you have for leadership in your current team to get better at this idea of flexing, of being able to have a hierarchy that's functional but also has moments of flexing within it? Okay, as you're finishing up your notes, summary from today. So hierarchy is inevitable. As much as I try to run away from it, and we all do at times, it's there to stay. We don't have a good alternative. If you ever find it, if you can find a better version of holacracy, that will be the Nobel Prize for Management. So if you are very audacious and brave as a young PhD student, daydream with me. Until then, figure out how to flex a hierarchy. Accept it, make it the best version of it that it could be. Design it well, find ways to minimize the inequity and resentment that you have within it, and find ways to make people feel good, to feel human, to have positive cultures within teams that still have a hierarchy. We have a few moments for questions, if anybody has questions. Yeah, please.
Can you repeat the question so people will hear? Sorry, just ask.
Yeah, sure.
Repeat the question when someone says it.
I will.
So that people who are dialing in can hear the question. Thank you.
When you did your study on students on trying to be expert and that typically led to a better outcome, and how did you apply that, or have your studies applied that to the CEO? So the CEO is often, in many cases, not the expert, and how would you recommend we think about that?
So the CEO should be the best expert of what's happening to the whole organization. So like you have deep expertise, so the CEO may not know as much about sales as their chief of marketing, but the CEO knows more about the company in its entirety than anybody else in the team. So it depends on how you define expertise. But in terms of oversight over the organization, it's like the job of a leader is that entire pond. And so the leader should know more about that entire pond than anybody else in the team. Great question. Oh, sorry, Jane. Yeah.
Could you cite a couple of companies that you really admire how they're organized and work effectively?
So the question was companies that I think work well. There's many that don't, which is why we have jobs. But I mean, as much as it's cliched, I do like Google as a company. I do think they've been very intentional and very thoughtful about the people side and have a fairly interesting balance of things like psychological safety really being pushed, but at the same time there is clear leadership and the founders are very much still looked up to as like heroes in the company. So that's probably one of the best ones I would point to. Honestly, it's easier at smaller companies to do this, and scaling it is hard. And Google is one of the only ones I know of at scale who's really good at this, but for many of my colleagues who do a lot of consulting work, I'd be curious for more ideas. The question over there.
Yeah, I'm curious about people being promoted based on expertise.
Oh. People, is it on? You can hear? Okay. So if the top of the hierarchy is based on expertise, as a coach, I work with a lot of people who are promoted based on their expertise but don't know anything about managing people. So how does that come into play? I'm sure you expected that question.
I love that question, actually. So the question was, if you promote people to the top of the hierarchy based on expertise, what about people's skills? Well, guess what? Data. People's skills are expertise, too. That should be part of your evaluation criteria as you're going into leadership. Is you need to understand, if you're a leader, say the CEO question, you have to understand enough about sales, enough about finance to understand what the people underneath you are doing. But the most important areas of expertise, particularly in leadership, is going to be people skills. When you talk to CEOs, the majority of their time and how they're spending their day is managing people. So that's arguably an even more important criteria to promote people on, and it's absolutely expertise. That's why we have MBA programs, why we have exec ed, is the idea that there is a data-driven set of knowledge, just like math, that we can teach people and is a form of expertise that you should be promoting people on. Soapbox, sorry. Anything else?
So I'm going to interrupt. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are more questions and people can come up and talk to Lindy. But it's just so amazing to me, Lindy. 40 years in this field, I thought hierarchy was pretty simple. And you've enriched how I think about it and how leaders can think about it, I think, in such important, useful ways. So please join me in a round of applause. And as is tradition, we love artifacts. So inside here is a special glass spiral that's meant to remind us all of the possibilities of generativity in any group or team. So thank you, Lindy. And I'll just use this as a shout out for my other wonderful colleague, Wayne Baker, who's going to do the last Positive Links this spring. I think it's on March 11th. I have it written down here. No, you don't have it up there. Okay. It's called, his title of his talk is It Really Better to Give Than Receive? It's based on his new book that that is out. And so he'll be here March 11th. Be here. Come back. Thank you, Lindy.
Thank you, Jane.
So good.